Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from MXDWN.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. We've got all kinds of stuff going on today and some interesting props. We'll get into that in a little bit. Part of today's story. First off, over to our friends in the United Kingdom and Mixdown UK. The Download Festival has announced its lineup. Now, we talk a lot in terms of music coverage in the American music festival scene and all the things that means. And there's tons of stuff happening there and all kinds of action. And of course, a good degree of the North American music scene's touring economy comes down to that festival scene as well. If the bands are big enough to play such events and are lucky enough to play such events. But we don't talk a lot about in America and the Western, hemisphere about what goes on in the UK and in Europe and beyond. And there is a ton of action over there. If you've never been over there, the festivals are incredible. There's all kinds of amazing stuff that happens outside of the Atlantic Ocean on the east side over there. And quite notably, the Download Festival in the UK is one of the great hard rock festivals that happens out there. Now, this one's interesting in that it's 4 days, kind of like Bonnaroo here in America. And 2 of the nights are going to be headlined by Metallica in keeping with their recent worldwide stadium tour and the double nights and different sets, not completing the same, not playing the same songs on more than one night like they've been doing. But then also what's really interesting about this is we get used to a certain kind of scene and a certain kind of booking in the world of the North American music scene, and certain bands that are what you'd expect to see are there, and certain bands represent the largest contingent of the populace and the population and what people are interested in. But then on the other hand, when you look at something happening in the UK, there's some interesting things in terms of where people's attention are. And certain bands are huge on that other side of the pond. But here in America, really never get the respect they may deserve. And, most notably in terms of this particular lineup, you'll find very high on the bill if you're to look for the poster online. Perturbator, which is a really aggressive and kind of discordant noise, kind of a metal thing, but more like a noise kind of electronic thing. Very, very heavy noise and electronic. But then also Placebo, who have been around for a long, long, long time, well over 20 years. And, their fans are not unheard of here in America. They certainly have their own audience. But here on this particular lineup, their third build on Saturday night, below Metallica and Disturbed. And then also Clutch, very high on the lineup. And Clutch is a wonderful band if you're not too familiar with Clutch and how they've kind of evolved. And I don't even know how you describe Clutch, because they certainly became a thing in America coming out of the heavy metal scene in the early 90s. But they're definitely not a heavy metal band in any conventional way. They're a rock band, they're a hard rock band, but they're a really fun, kind of groovy take on what it means to be a rock band. And then, of course, lastly, the original Connecticut hardcore band Hatebreed by Jamie Jostos, and all kinds of projects in his own kind of cottage industry. So just some really interesting stuff happening over there. 4 days is a lot for any festival. And as a person who at one point set a record of seeing 54 bands in 3 days at South by Southwest, even me, I would wince a little bit at the thought of being at a festival for 4 days straight, all day and all night. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff happening. Elsewhere in the world of television, and what we would call very sad news, the legendary comedian Richard Belzer has passed away. Now, he was 78 years old. Now, some of you may know him very, very well. Some of you may not be super familiar with his output and the things that he's done. He has been famous in stand-up comedy circles for decades upon decades, and famously was like the warm-up act on Saturday Night Live in its original generation in the 70s, but has become known to many, many, many people in North America for his output on television. And he would play a detective on numerous shows over a period of about 25 years. Most famously being amidst them Homicide: Life on the Street, and then reprising that same character he played in Law and Order Special Victims Unit. Between those two shows, he played 7 years on the first one and then a whopping 14 seasons over 10 years on the second one. Now, he had kind of, not exactly retired, but he had stepped back from being a regular on these shows, and then he passed away at his home in the south of France. And a friend of his named Bill Sheft, who gave statements to The Hollywood Reporter and other magazines, claimed that, well, we don't have an exact cause of death, and this is only coming from this one friend, so we can't call this necessarily any kind of cause of death, that he had lots of health issues, apparently circulatory and respiratory issues, this is, of course, according to his friend Bill Sheft. And according to this guy, literally sardonic up to his last, Richard Belzer went out, and his last words were, and no, I'm not kidding, fuck you, motherfucker. Don't know the context or the circumstances of that, but he was a really, really wonderful and smart comedian and held the flag very, very high for the world of stand-up comedy. If you're not familiar, please check it out. I've done tons of stuff over numerous decades. Now, I haven't heard this talked about very much in terms of coverage, and maybe it's just the swirling chaos of our world right now. Maybe it's just how difficult things are and how much ground there is to cover and how much uncertainty and concerns about inflation. Maybe it's just getting buried. But right now, there's been an update on the actor Bruce Willis's condition. Now, Bruce Willis is an incredible, incredible actor, and one of those kinds of actors who always really did amazing, amazing work, but is never going to be a person who won Oscars behind their work. Probably should have on a bunch of different occasions for certain movies over the course of his career, and of course, came to fame as a part of starring alongside Sybil Shepherd on the famed television show Moonlighting in the late 80s, and then became a movie star behind the action thriller Die Hard. And that's his whole own brand of craziness and action and shooting and violence. It is really a wonderful movie, and to some people, a Hallmark Christmas movie, since the movie takes place right at Christmas time and features lots of Christmas songs. There's some people I know who that's their annual tradition to watch Die Hard every Christmas, and had a wonderful, wonderful career playing in all kinds of different movies and just generally being an awesome actor and doing a great job. And lately, in the last 10 or 15 years of his career, output hasn't been quite as good, not as critically revered. Maybe some of the movies he's been choosing haven't been so good. And, a few months back, it was basically announced that he was stepping back from acting because he was having memory problems. And they had described his condition as aphasia. Now, his family has updated the world in terms of what was going on with him. They had numerous tests done, and they upgraded his diagnosis to frontotemporal dementia. And effectively, this is a rare varietal of dementia. If you're not familiar with dementia and you're not familiar with Alzheimer's, this is another one of those degenerative brain conditions where olfactory conditions abilities start to decline as things go on. And effectively, this particular one is a degenerative disease, and it usually will come down to affecting the ability for the person suffering from it to communicate. The family of Bruce Willis has indicated that his condition has progressed, and that's obviously not a good thing in a bad way. And just as a briefest of primers, and I'm going to go deep into medical jargon here because that's its own whole hornet's nest, but the Alzheimer's Association describes frontotemporal dementia appropriately as such. Frontotemporal dementia refers to a group of disorders caused by progressive nerve cell loss in the brain's frontal lobes, the area behind your forehead, or its temporal lobes, the region behind your ears. The nerve cell damage caused by frontotemporal dementia leads to loss of function in these brain regions, which variably causes deterioration in behavior, personality, and or difficulty with producing or comprehending language. So, like all forms of dementia and Alzheimer's, there usually isn't some form of a cure. There are ways to slow symptoms. There are ways to improve quality of life. It's a sad, sad, sad thing to hear that such a wonderful, wonderful person, and Bruce Willis is going through this right now. And I mean, if you're not familiar, if you're a younger person watching this show or seeing one of the recaps or clips of this show that we put online, his output is daunting in terms of the number of things he did. Some things were a little bit cornier and a little bit sillier. He certainly dabbled in different kinds of movies over the course of his career, but most significantly, there's, of course, Die Hard, which we referred to a moment ago, the legendary and masterpiece Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino. There's the incredible and bizarre movie 12 Monkeys. There is the wonderful sci-fi, bizarre, and hilarious The Fifth Element. He played the assassin, the Jackal, in a remake of The Jackal. Of course, the famed movie The Sixth Sense. And then, of course, also Frank Miller and Robert Rodriguez adaptation of the famed Sin City comic book, Sin City. And last but not least, amidst too many other movies that I'm not going to list them all for you, but Moonrise Kingdom, ultimately, another of Wes Anderson's romps with many of his, usual actors that he works with. So to everyone in Bruce Willis's family and all his fans, it's a tragic day and sad to hear this as far as what's going on with him. I wish I could hope for something in terms of recovery, in terms of repair. According to what I understand in medical science and what's out there, things like this don't tend to be recoverable and recuperable. But whatever the case may be, all our best thoughts to Bruce Willis and his entire family. Moving on in the world of movies, we talked a little bit about Ant-Man 3, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, which I reviewed and discussed in detail in our previous show. I mentioned a host of concerns, like it's not a bad movie, it's not terrible in that respect, but it was in some ways one of the more uneven Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, and also banks a lot on Jonathan Majors' performance as Kang the Conqueror. It eschews so much of what made the original funny and charming, and Paul Rudd's personality and everything. And some of that may be starting to bear out. We'll see. I mean, at the end of the day, movies is a business. If it makes money and it sells tickets, they're going to keep making them, and they're going to keep making them the way they did if people keep going to them. So over the first weekend, which just happened to be a President's Day weekend, of course, then over the 3-day stretch, the movie made 106 million. But then over the long 3-day weekend, as we call it, but technically Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, the movie made 120 million. Now, a lot and much and more will depend on what happens in weekend 2. Avatar hung around for about 3 or 4 months, endlessly selling tickets over the last few months because there hasn't been a lot of competition in the world of movies. We'll see if that has anything to do with what happens. But notably, critics have more or less lined up in the same alignment of what I basically indicated in my review. I guess I'm not far off from what other people are thinking about this particular movie, but ultimately this lands as far as the Rotten Tomatoes score, which is a thing that a lot of people kind of hedge their bets on in terms of what movies they are going to see or are not going to see. Effectively, it is landing at the second lowest for any Marvel Studios picture thus far, which is a 49%, or just barely under the rotten threshold. And effectively, that is only worse by the movie The Eternals, the Chloe Zhao movie that came out during the pandemic, or as the pandemic was progressing, however you want to look at it, and which is just an awful movie, probably one of the worst superhero movies ever made. So effectively, at least as far as the critical estimation is concerned, they're landing a lot on the same token with that. And then lastly, just because it has connections to a lot of different things we've been talking about, and how the evolving state of the industry is, Gorillaz, who we spoke a little bit about last week when we were talking about the demise of De La Soul's Trugoy the Dove. Gorillaz, which is the wonderful kind of a cartoon, kind of a real thing, always an endless series of collaborations band fronted by Blur lead singer Damon Albarn, effectively had an animated movie that was in the works. And effectively, this animated movie is apparently completely no more. Now, ultimately, Stereogum caught wind of an interview done with the Belgian publication Humo, Humo, and then they took the time to translate it from Dutch. And ultimately, Albarn had indicated that there had been in the works something that spoke to an animated film, but that it was no longer happening. When inquired about what was going on with that, Albarn indicated, yes, that is to say that without naming names, because the whole matter has not yet been settled, the streaming platform for which we're making the film has withdrawn. They started to panic, and because they were making too much content and decided to cut back on their movie offerings. And has been classic Hollywood practice for decades, the guy we're working with has moved on to another company. From then on, you have lost your guardian angel, and there seems to be a bad smell hanging on you. Hollywood is quite territorial. If a new guy comes along, he must and will have a different opinion, even if he secretly agrees with his predecessor. So this is a part of a larger narrative of everything kind of shifted after years and years and years of, it was VHS sales, and then it was DVD sales, and then it was kind of becoming Blu-ray sales, that effectively the whole world had kind of galvanized around the notion that effectively, you would go to a movie in a theater, and then several months later it would come out, and then you could buy it. Okay, now people had rental stores back in the day. If you're really, if you're an older person, you were around 20 years ago, then you remember there was Blockbuster Video, and there were rental stores, and that was a big part of people's life. But then, of course, Netflix came on the scene, and the ability to get things easily on demand became a reality. And never mind getting DVDs delivered to your door, then streaming video became a big part of everyone's life once Netflix showed how easy it could be. So then everywhere you look, different services started to pop up with streaming video. HBO made a big push for it. Disney made its own big push with Disney Plus. Hulu had its own content. And then one by one, everywhere you looked, there was another streaming platform, another streaming package, another thing that people wanted you to pay for. Now, a lot of people have very quickly turned into this as the demise of physical media because, effectively, if you can get it streaming easily, why own it? People are like, why do I want this stuff around? Why do I want to pay for it? If I can have something where a la carte when I want to, I do it. This is why if you go around and say you're a person who for a while had DVDs and you go to try to sell them now, no one will give you anything for them. You can hand them in for free, and they'll usually get melted down or discarded. And it was just not that long ago that everyone was being expected to spend $20, $25 for a recently released feature film. So effectively, this has kind of been the massive change in terms of the way the industry works. And there was expansion. Let's make more content. Let's find more content. And for some respects, that's been really good because a lot of things have gotten a chance that never would have. And take something like Stranger Things, for example. Stranger Things would never have existed if it wasn't that, streaming and Netflix was the capability to even try something like that and give it a chance to work. And the old days of television, that just never would have been a reality. So what we have now is that it's reached max capacity. We've reached market saturation, and now there's starting to be contraction. There's starting to be a situation where a lot of these studios are realizing how much money they're spending to make this content. And then there's, of course, the whole facet in the business side of residuals, right? People who make these things are entitled residuals for playback and the amount of times that things are played, and that costs money. Now, we've seen that in terms of HBO content and the new head of HBO in terms of their marketing. HBO has one of the best TV departments that the world has ever seen. And Casey Bloys, the guy who's in charge of HBO's TV department now, has been massively ratcheting back on terms of what shows they're allowing to be on. And one of the better shows of the last bunch of years, Westworld, plug was pulled. And not only was the plug pulled, but the whole show was taken off HBO and shipped over to Tubi, this new fast mobile service, this system that'll basically, it's like ad-supported streaming television. And HBO didn't even want it. They didn't want to pay for the residuals. They didn't even want to have it on the platform. It made more sense for them, kind of like it was a baseball player and a baseball team that was being traded. They don't want to pay the salary anymore. Like, let someone else pay that salary. We don't want to have that person. We don't think it would be good for us to even have that person, even though we'd already agreed to pay them. So you're starting to see a contraction in all ways, shapes, and forms of what this content could be and happen. And now, of course, even a band like Gorillaz, and those of us who follow music, even though it may not be their exact prime following Plastic Beach, they're still second headliner Friday of Coachella this year. They're a massive arena sellout band wherever they go, especially in the United Kingdom. They're a wonderful, wonderful, amazing, crazy artistic pop project with tons of great collaborators. And, sadly, only that, like Sugar the Dove recently, some of their great collaborators have passed on or aren't with us anymore. Effectively, even they are not immune from what this all means. And, Damon Albarn describes a situation where effectively the person who was their shepherd through this process and was bringing them along and was a champion of them having their own movie based on their cartoon characters, Murdoch and Noodles and, 2D and everything that was basically the characters of the band that usually show up in their music videos, it just wasn't enough. Probably very expensive. Animated movies cost a lot of money. Even if you've got newfound technology and ways to do it, they're not easy things to generate. It is very, very costly to make those things a reality. And so even that is not safe from this. And this is a big part of the reason why I've argued, as great as it is, the streaming media is a thing. I'm still a person who still holds on to some measure of physical media because, it might be great if at one point a show is on this platform and I don't mind paying for it if I know I can watch whatever I want, whenever I want from it. But what if one day they just decide, hey, this isn't worth having? What if this isn't worth holding on to in the platform? And now we're going to dump that and you have to get that somewhere else. I'm not a fan of that, me personally. I probably way too much media, as it were. But even in that token, I don't like the notion that if there's something that I could own and I do own it, well, I could certainly watch that whenever I want, and I'll always have to know that it's there. It's safe. I don't have to worry about that happening. So I would expect a lot of contraction in this respect. I would expect to hear more about shows being dumped or taken off, and you might find yourself in these positions where, not even like when Futurama came off Netflix, and a lot of people were upset about that, but you might hear about certain things just being dumped completely. And then it becomes a thing where, yes, again, you want to watch it, you got to find it on Blu-ray, you got to find it on DVD or somehow else. So that's all for our stories for today, but we're going to go into, basically a little bit of something different today, and you'll see it right here next to me. So for our monologue today, for our story, I want to talk a little bit about comic books. Now, effectively, we in Mixdown, of course, we cover a lot of things that have to do with superheroes, especially because of how they have come to dominate what we regard as popular movies and television. And of course, in the last couple of years, some of the only movies that can make really good money are superhero movies, and it's become kind of its own tug of war within Hollywood. There's a degree of disdain amongst people who like high art cinema, and they're tired of superhero movies. Maybe they like some of them, but they're tired of the formula. And then, of course, there's plenty of fans that certainly have made it possible for superhero movies to be a big success, and of course, young kids. And effectively, there has kind of been the steamroller on mainstream content. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of that, where that comes from, how that factors in, and why there's this endless supply of, fans and support for what this is. And effectively, comic books are if you're not familiar, is kind of an evolution of what is commonly known as editorial cartoons. Newspapers, dating back 150 years ago, started to have paid illustrators that would come and make little funny cartoons, usually as political satire, usually aimed at being something that was targeted at what was happening in the world, or a commentary on something that seemed unjust or unfair. And little by little, more and more, as more newspapers became a reality, as more and more newspapers became bigger and bigger business in terms of, what was mass media at the time. It's hard to even imagine a world with the internet when the only thing that existed, there was no moving pictures. There was no, it was barely some photography if you, had access or you had the patience. But newspapers were the most common way the information was distributed. And effectively, as that became more and more proliferate, as there started to be more and more newspaper content, more and more editorial cartoons, eventually these things started getting packaged. Now, I don't want to go toe to toe with any comic nerds out there, because there's a lot of them and they spend more time than I do thinking about this stuff. But some of the things that I've heard thrown around is there was an early character called the Yellow Kid, and there's a book called Coming Up Father. And effectively, these were some of the earliest times that things were packaged into what we commonly regard as a comic book. Now, effectively, as that started to set in, then there started being more effort put into it. A lot of those early comics, like Motion Pictures Weekly or Large Feature Syndicate, were collections of things that were kind of existing as cartoonish characters within comic strips. One of the funny things that I heard mentioned a long time ago that's absolutely true is that Popeye, who's an incredibly famous character, there have been whole feature-length movies made about the character, it's been around well over 100 years, was a third or fourth string character in a thing called Large Feature Syndicate, and effectively then became really popular and started being their own title. Of course, you saw a lot of those early Disney cartoons that got factored into what comic books were, and then eventually the kind of capes and cowls, costumed heroes started to become a thing. And then you have in the late 30s where Superman and Batman, as a part of DC Comics, come to life. Fun fact that I didn't even know until recently, DC Comics, which is where all of the, Superman, Batman, the Flash, Aquaman, all those characters exist, and we've also talked about that a lot as it pertains to James Gunn and the DCU, effectively is a derivative of where Batman first appeared, which was a story called, a comic book, a regular comic book called Detective Comics. So kind of like how in Los Angeles for a long time we had a music festival called FYF Fest, which meant Fuck Yeah Fest. So FYF Fest was Fuck Yeah Fest. So DC Comics is DC Detective Comics. Anyway, nothing really to do with anything in the price of tea in China, but effectively, these comic books start to become a bigger part of kids' lives. These characters start to influence people. And then, of course, we have several generations evolution. That original early, 30s, 40s age is commonly referred to as the Golden Age. And then, of course, certain things changed as World War II happened, and Captain America was one of the books born in that era. And then eventually there's like a gestation in the 50s, and then eventually that transmutes into the 60s, which is commonly referred to as the Silver Age era. Now, a lot of the comic book movies you've heard of or seen, and of course, all of Marvel Studios fare, all those big characters, your X-Men, your Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, they all come about, and Spider-Man, of course, not to be left out, all come about in that late 60s era. And then things become kind of mass market industry, right? Little by little, movies get made, shows get made. This becomes more and more a part of just everyone's known folklore in our country, and of course, all of the world by extension of that. So for me, growing up a kid in the 80s, and like a lot of kids liking comic books and superheroes, is just an obvious, easy thing. They were around. My father ran a convenience store, and my father kind of did a little bit of everything, did antiques and just sold collectibles, but also sold baseball cards and comic books. And so he really had a thing for comic books, being a dealer in the early 80s when things really started to become first a thing with collecting comic books. And, I just was that kind of nerd who would sit around with what was called the Overstreet Price Guide, which is just this massive, like, Bible-sized book that just lists every comic in existence, or at least most of them nowadays, maybe not all of them anymore. There's been so much. And then effectively what their prices were. It maps major characters and where their first appearances. So if you wanted to know, like, where Ant-Man came from, you could basically reverse engineer it to Tales of the Astonished 27. If you wanted to know where Iron Man came from, you could find it was from Tales of Suspense number 39. And I was that kind of nerd who just would sit there thumbing through the price guide learning about it. So my dad, occasionally going to comic book shows to, make extra money, would always buy and sell comic books, but sometimes would like to set up. He'd take me with him, and I'd basically help him do it. I'd help him bring out the boxes. I'd help him set things up. I'd help him referee and navigate with customers. And my dad was amazing at understanding people, how to talk to them, and to also find out what they're interested in, to make deals. My dad didn't have the affinity that some people do when they're in the market of selling things or merchandise, where there's like beholden to really, really trying to fight for a certain price point. My dad's whole methodology was just find a way to sell it, find a way to make a deal. If they're interested, find a way to put something out there. And one of the fun things about being with him in those days and going to those comic book shows, and you got to remember, things weren't like what they are now. One of the most sought after comic books there is the first appearance of, say, Spider-Man, which is Amazing Fantasy number 15, if you're curious, if you don't know it. And of course, then the book right after that, the second appearance, the very famous Amazing Spider-Man number 1. So in those days, in the early 90s, you were talking about like maybe $3,000 or $4,000 for each of those books. And that was considered a lot of money in those days. It was a really big deal. It was like, whoa, Amazing Fantasy 15 is a $4,000 book. Wow, that's crazy. And effectively, it was only then that the real giants of yesteryear, with your Action Comics number 1, the first appearance of Superman, or Detective Comics number 27, the first appearance of Batman, started to become like worth money. And there was talk that like, Action Comics number 1 was going for like $100,000. Nowadays, these numbers blow all that out of the water, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But what was fun in those days, given that there wasn't a ton that was worth a ton of money, even very, very rare books or very, very sought after books rarely reached the point of like $1,000. That just didn't really happen in the early 90s. And what was really a joy doing this with my father at that phase of my life was essentially being able to go into these comic book shows, and there's a lot of dealers around us. Dealers are their own kind of interesting animal, and effectively, see them kind of chest out, acting a certain way, like they're all special and barely selling anything. And then here my dad comes in, an unassuming person, and just blows them out of the water and selling books left, right, and center. Stuff for these people who are looking vintage stuff, kids who are looking for like 3 books, for $1, pulling out tons from a 3 for $1 box, and just watching that commerce in action massively. So that was a big part of that early phase of my life. I learned about being a merchant. I learned about buying for $1 and selling for $2. I learned about just basically how to find things like that and how to capture that passion. It's always been very helpful for me in terms of being editor-in-chief at Mixdown, especially over a movie site, because when it comes to movies content, what's happening in comics is always kind of like a framework for what could be done in movies. You'll often find that some of the biggest and most exciting stories are ultimately what gets ending up being adapted for these movies. You have the Wolverine, Weapon X saga. You have, Captain Marvel finding her powers, as Carol Danvers. You have, ultimately, Professor X and the X-Men. You have, the Winter Soldier and Captain America. These are all things that were a part of the comic book story, and they were all famous stories in the comic book world before they eventually became adapted into films. So sometimes in terms of anticipating what people's interest is, you need to look no further than what people in comic books are freaking out about. Because at the end of the day, what comic book fans are always excited about almost always inevitably bubbles up to becoming feature-length movies. A lot of people said, I remember, running around Los Angeles 20 years ago in the early 2000s, that a big part of why comic books were so helpful was that they were like basically already storyboarded movies. You have a story, you have a script, you have the stage, you have the setting, you have the storyboards. Comic books in their, cell-based approach to narrative basically give you everything that's there. And of course, it's an endless supply of interest. People who get into comic books tend to stay into comic books over a period of a large number of decades. They don't tend to get distracted or displeased with them. They tend to stay fans, if nothing else, for at least what they were a fan of when they were younger. But then there's always a new crop of young kids that get in, that get involved, that get excited about comic books and what it is and the characters, and then look back to what the characters were before. Because most characters that have significance, unless there's something newer, like, say, Spider-Gwen, Gwen Stacy, or, you have something like Gwenom nowadays, or Squirrel Girl, maybe they weren't so big 20, 30 years ago. But generally, a lot of these characters exist. Iron Man and Captain America have been around forever. Going on 60 years now, even for Iron Man, never mind Captain America, which debuted in the 40s, 80 some years ago. So effectively, there's a big part of this that has always been just kind of a perfectly connected bit of like people's excitement in terms of what the world, in terms of this fantasy and this fiction is concerned. And it's just something that people can't really get enough of. When I was in college, I read a book called Understanding Comics. It was by a really brilliant comic book artist named Scott McCloud. And he posited within that story within that book. It's not really a story, but it's like a artistic dissection of what makes comic books what it is. That a big part of what allowed people to like comic books so much was the abstraction. The fact that it wasn't photoreal, that there was like some layer of implied motion and there was implied features, but that abstraction in terms of that not detail being filled out to the fullest was what ultimately led to people wanting to fill in the blanks with their own imagination, allowing for that ability for people to imagine what it is that they thought a character would be or would look like or would behave like. That just that limited amount of reduced reality, that like perfect description and vivid detail, is basically an endless source of imagination and inspiration. And you can see that as the decades roll on, and there's just an endlessly renewable supply of fans. So now you fast forward to now, and the world of comic book dealing and collecting is its whole own avenue. Back in the day, when you were dealing in comic books, there was like an assumed scale of how things were. You'd have near mint, basically meant almost undamaged. You would have fine or very fine, usually first, and then fine. And that basically meant like not quite mint, but not destroyed, in more or less, pretty great condition. Then you'd have very good and good, which in spite of the label, don't let it fool you, not so good. Good, very good or good condition means pretty bad. And then, of course, you would have the very obvious poor or very poor, basically mean in tatters and wrecked. And then ostensibly what you dealt with comic books and selling comic books in those days, it was essentially about what did you think something was and what did the buyer think it was? What do you agree on that it was? And back in those days, everything and anything was the Overstreet comic book price guide. Things would be basically determined on their scale of what things were worth. And generally, the value of books was usually worked off of the near mint value, even though maybe books weren't near mint. There would be some measure of negotiation behind what that was. And effectively, that used to be how it worked. So it was always just what does one person think versus what other person think? This feels like this to me. Oh, okay, sure. Now, somewhere along the line, a company, and there are several, but most prominently a company called the Certified Guarantee Company, came up with the idea of what they called grading comic books. And there's CBCS, and there's a few other companies that do this. But really, when you deal in comic books or you're looking for comic books or looking to buy them, you're very often going to see exactly what you see here right on my right, which is what they call graded or slabbed, if you're running in circles that basically are people who are hardcore comic book dealers or collectors, where they basically hermetically seal the comic book and they give it a score. Now, this is not unlike, if you're a music fan, the world of Pitchfork, where they give a score on an album on a 100-point scale, 0.0 to 10.0. 10.0 basically being perfect, and of course anything north of a 9 meaning it's a really great piece of work. And effectively, what you have is that this basically is a way of determining overall quality. They transmuted that near mint to a 9.2, and then basically anything north of a 9.2 is considered exceptional. And of course, there are tales of something being 9.9 or a 10.0, but that rarely, if ever, happens. Now, the thing that's really crazy about the world of comic book dealing and collecting is that, that Overstreet price guide near mint price that most people abided by and accepted, that was based on that like 9.2 score. And now what you have is an environment that people will pay a massive premium for a book that scores higher than that. So a book like the Max number 1 here, which is a 9.8, that is usually regarded as like a $10 book. If it's in a 9.8, that would mean it's about $100. Now you get into some really, really crazy things. Say you're dealing with something like Amazing Spider-Man 129, the first appearance of the Punisher, which is a book that in a near mint condition is usually $1,200. Nowadays, you could be looking at $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 if you had a 9.8, because it's considered so hard to find a book that old that's in that good a condition. This is also why, like recently, an Amazing Spider-Man number 1 went for something like $3 million because its score was so high when it went up for auction. And effectively, this has become a big part of the chase and the hunt. Now, the funny thing about all of this is that if you have a book, like say here, we have The Life of Captain Marvel, which is a more recent one. Once it's graded like this, you can't read it anymore. But a lot of people favor that. Comic book collectors and comic book dealers, they're kind of a different, situation in terms of the way they think about things, because effectively, on some level, it's kind of like they're trying to hold a piece of vintage art, and they're trying to make sure that piece of art is perfectly preserved. So they're willing to sacrifice the ability to actually flip through and read it, which might be anathema to a lot of people. Like, why the hell would you own something like this if you didn't want to read it? A lot of folks do this purely as a collector. They want to be able to show off and say, I have this, and I have this at this condition. I have this book in a higher grade than you, and it doesn't matter if I can't read it. I still own it, and it's perfectly preserved. It will be, unless, I set it on fire or drop the case in a vat of acid or something. It will be perfectly preserved. And so they're willing to sacrifice that ability to be able to have something and own it in that degree of quality. And then effectively it becomes, for a lot of people, a bargaining chip, right? Like a way to create value. And this is how comic book dealing is done now. Now there's all kinds of avenues, and there's different websites like Comic Lick and Comics Exchange, where people basically buy and sell comic books. There's a huge community of people on Instagram who are, I don't know, Instagram sellers, for lack of a better term, who effectively go through and are constantly dealing and buying and selling books and building their own audiences. And, the advantage of that is, of course, unlike the old days, you had to have a brick and mortar store, you had to have a place to go, or you had to go to a comic book show. Now you can be anyone, anywhere. And as long as you're willing to ship to people and you are good at pick, pack, and ship and making sure things get to people, it can go very well. And then, of course, eBay, which seems to be the pace car that sets the price for the whole market. Whenever you hear anybody talk about any rare book or any book that's worth money, or say if you had something like this, you had Star Wars #1. Switch the camera over there. If you had Star Wars #1, ultimately it's what's going for on eBay that sets the price as far as what people are willing to pay for it. And then there's even sometimes special commodities, like, say, for example, this is Iron Man 55, which is famous in the comic world as being the first appearance of the villain Thanos, who is, of course, the arc villain behind the Infinity Saga and the Marvel Cinematic Universe Infinity Saga series of movies, culminating with Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Effectively, this book is signed, you can't really see it on camera, but it's signed by Robert Downey Jr. Robert Downey Jr. signed this one. And sometimes they do special premiums where people are able to get a signature on a book, usually by the creator, the artist, the writer. But then sometimes the actors who played the characters, have been happening a lot recently with other, actors playing in the major superhero movies. And so effectively, this has become its own economy, its own ecosystem. You ask around comic book shows, even in comic book stores in Los Angeles, and if like a new book gets hot, basically there's a whole legion of dealers that will just call around town trying to gobble up every book, every copy of that book, and try to swing for the fences, send them in to get graded in hopes that they'll come out with a very high score, and then they can turn around and flip it for a price. And so there's this ravenous pack of people out there just constantly scrambling for these things. But then also there are people who just collect them. They just want them to have them. And this is the thing that feels really special to them, to own a piece of history like this. And like anything in terms of supply and demand economics, the more copies of a thing there are, like this wonderful, book that's one of my favorite TV shows that was ever existed, that was adapted on MTV and oddities, called The Max. The comic book, there were trillions of copies of it out there. They didn't sell very well. And so that means they're usually not worth as much. It's very special to me. I'm very happy to own this particular thing myself. But, of course, if something is rarer, like Iron Man 55 here, which you can't find every single day, the value goes up considerably, being able to have something that not everyone can get. So ultimately, it's its all own crazy ecosystem. And of course, comic book nerds are like electronic music nerds or heavy metal nerds. They have insular notions over what is appropriate and what is technically okay as far as the subject matter. They have big opinions in terms of what major studios and major companies holding intellectual property should do with them. But ultimately, this is a fascinating kind of hemisphere to get a sense of what is going to be popular. Now, having some vague awareness of what's going on in the world of comic books, and knowing that the character Nyx, or essentially X-23, was coming from that storyline, that's Wolverine's daughter, if you didn't see the movie Logan, that inevitably there was going to be a movie like Logan that featured Wolverine's daughter. Didn't take much to figure out that was going to be the thing. If you were a child of the 90s and you watched the X-Men cartoon, it was inevitable that the Dark Phoenix saga was going to be adapted, and it kind of got adapted a couple different ways in the X-Men movies that, Fox was putting out before Fox and the X-Men characters were reacquired by Disney and Marvel Studios. So this is a very useful thing in terms of understanding a lot of subject matter that was going to come. And even some things a little further off the beaten path, right? Like, in the 80s, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became popular because it was one of the first really successful independent comics that then got adapted into a more kid-friendly format as the cartoon that came out in the late 80s. But then all kinds of things have started to hit. Like you have The Walking Dead, which was an offshoot of Image Comics, and effectively, which was like one of the first major breaks from from the major studios in the '90s. Todd McFarlane created Image Comics for his comic book Spawn, which is still around today. And then effectively, The Walking Dead became, for a while there, until it kind of jumped the shark in its own way and people kind of got sick of it. The Walking Dead was the most successful show almost ever on television. People were obsessed with that show for years on end until the Negan storyline hit. And, ultimately, then sometimes to lesser extent, to lesser success, there are things like Why the Last Man, and that got adapted, and that started to become a thing that then got canceled after a season because the show wasn't successful enough. So it's super useful in terms of anticipating, the meta, in terms of anticipating what's coming. And it's kind of a fascinating little world in terms of the dynamics of what's going. But it's, of course, if anything, if you're a person looking for investment opportunities, as you would look at, if you're looking at like a stock trading website, you would basically see a bunch of disclaimers. Investing in things is risky. Consider your options and your terms of what your money is, what money you have to value, because just because something is worth a lot at one point doesn't mean it's guaranteed to go up over time. Now, as inflation hit like an anvil over the last year in terms of the Western world here in North America and the United States, one of the things that nobody anticipated was several years straight of comic books and the value of collectibles skyrocketing, effectively going to just crazy heights of all kinds of things, even relatively recent books like the first appearance of Kate Bishop, who showed up in, Hawkeye on Disney Plus. And like, that's not that old of a book. And it was selling for like several $100s for a first appearance of that character. A lot of this stuff, and the perfect example is the, Thor God of Thunder, which is what essentially is the comic that ultimately became Thor Love and Thunder, the movie from last year. And effectively, some of those books were going for astronomical prices of $800 a book, and they have cratered completely within a span of a year. The movie was not super well received, and now that same book that might have been $800 or $1,000 before is like $150. So there's an inherent risk involved. So if you're someone who thinks this is interesting, or if you're already a fan of comic books, if you're not already doing this, or even if you are already doing this, if you decide to go try to dabble with this kind of stuff, exercise caution, because it is volatile. It doesn't necessarily mean that because once it was worth something and then it became worth a lot means it's going to stay there. I mean, a large part of the collectibles boom from 2 years ago came from the part that Congress had basically approved economic bailouts because everyone was hiding inside because of the COVID epidemic, or pandemic, I should say. And then effectively what ended up happening was that people, instead of using that money for savings or the future or to pay their bills or to make sure that everything is safe, some people were not really in much danger, or maybe they lived a life where it was already kind of working from home anyways. And then they poured that money into the collectibles market, which meant that collectibles went through the roof. And then once that faucet got turned off and that money wasn't there, the price started to drop again. So consider all that in this, but if nothing else, it is fascinating and interesting little world and its own little dynamics. So that is all for this week's edition of This Week is Live. We thank you so much for joining us every week. And if you're looking at this in all the different places that we share this, whether it's in Twitter, whether it's in Facebook, whether it's in Instagram or YouTube Shorts, we thank you for joining us and watching this content, engaging with it. If you haven't already, please follow us on Twitch, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us anywhere on the internet as at MXDWN, or of course on YouTube specifically as at MXDWN Video. Please join us each and every week. We're here every week on Thursdays, roughly around 5:30 p.m. Pacific, and then we post these episodes a couple days later on YouTube. So effectively, join us next week. We'll hear every week with stories and headlines, and then surprises to come this year, I promise. No rush on that, but we're going to get there. There's going to be all kinds of interesting things coming. So once again, thanks for joining us. So glad to see you well.